Hello, good evening, and welcome. I've never been that successful at silencing a crowd, so thank you for your cooperation. Hi, I'm Rich Asti. I'm the museum's third director. I'd like to welcome all of you to the McNay Art Museum. It's our great honor tonight to host the conversation with veteran journalist Corey Flintoff. And in addition to welcoming Corey, we very warmly welcome Texas Public Radio and the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, and in particular their respective leaders who are gracing us with their presence tonight, Joyce Slocum and Leslie Palmer. Now, I just met Leslie tonight for the very first time. I've only been here 9 months, but I had the great pleasure of meeting Joyce at TPR in September on my third day on the job. So thank you, Joyce, for being very kind to me. I'm still standing. And more recently, I went back for more at TPR on behalf of the McNay, very proudly joining TPR's Dare to Listen campaign. You may have heard my voice there on behalf of the institution. And there I spoke of the direction we're going in at the McNay, less in the model of an elite temple of art, and more in the direction of a welcoming community center, a vibrant community center where every member of our visitors feels safe. Safe to be inspired. Thank you. Everyone who comes through our 23 acres feels safe to not only be inspired by our world-class collection, but also safe to emotionally grow. And they do this by looking and by listening and even by questioning the world around them and finding their own very special place within that ever-shifting world. So tonight's opportunity to listen to Corey Flintoff is a fine example of the McNay's commitment to that Texas Public Radio campaign, and we're very humbled that we are that platform for our city. Or, as the McNay's first Hispanic director of this great institution, mi McNay es verdaderamente su McNay. So before you hear from Mr. Flintoff, I'd like to ask you to please join me in welcoming to the stage my esteemed colleague and friend at Texas Public Radio, Joyce Slocum. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich. We so appreciate the McNay lending us the use of this beautiful space for tonight's event. Y'all are always a joy to work with. We are so lucky to have Rich with us in town. So how about another round of applause for him? I've said that someday I'm going to print my remarks out in large enough font that I won't have to wear these glasses, but I'm a little afraid that me, coming to the podium with a tome about that thick would scare you all to the door. So sorry for the cheaters. But welcome to TPR's conversation with Corey Flintoff. I want to thank the sponsors who have helped make possible what is sure to be a fascinating discussion: Jefferson Cano, a San Antonio law firm, and St. Mary's University Graduate Studies. So a round of applause for those sponsors. And last, but certainly not least, the World Affairs Council of San Antonio. It is a wonderful thing to have an intelligent, eager, and easy collaborator. And that is what I have found in Leslie Palmer since she joined the World Affairs Council's executive director just a little less than a year ago, July of last year. So when I mentioned the possibility of this event, Leslie immediately put her hand up and said, "We're in." And that is what we love. So Leslie, could you come up and share just a little bit about World Affairs Council for those who may not be aware?
So I wear my glasses all the time, so you're never going to get them. No, I don't know who I am when I look in the mirror without them. Being able to join a stage with Joyce and Rich to be talking before Corey Flintoff is something pretty much I'm pinching myself about. TPR is a leader in this community, and for the World Affairs Council that's been a part of this community for 35 years, to join in a partnership like this speaks volumes about who we are as a community and where we are going together. Rich's comments really pretty much mirrored mine, so I'm going to speak a little off the cuff for a moment, but I too am on TPR about the Dare to Listen and about what TPR means to our community. And in this moment, and in all the programming that the World Affairs Council presents. We are hoping that we present the issues, people come away knowing a little bit more, and we all are able to make up our own minds on what we believe, what we think, where we're going, and where this world is taking us. I know that will be a part of tonight, and I want to thank Joyce for welcoming this partnership, and I look forward to it happening over and over and over again. I would be remiss also if I did not thank our board, of which Joyce is a part, our chair-elect, Nick Hollis is here, and quite a number of other of our board members. I want to thank you all for being here, for your support as I grew through this year, and we grew together, and we will go on for many more years to come. Thank you all very much for being here with us, and I know this is going to be an amazing conversation. Thank you for joining us as well. Thanks.
Public displays of affection. So just a few quick housekeeping items. Please silence your cell phones. This is particularly important tonight because we are recording this conversation so that people who are not able to get tickets will be able to listen to it on the tpr.org website. Second, just a note that the views and opinions expressed tonight are those of the respective speakers and do not represent the position or opinions of Texas Public Radio or any of our sponsors. And finally, we're not going to interrupt the speakers for questions, but time permitting, we will have a Q&A period at the end of their presentation. And with that, I'd like to ask our speakers to come to their chairs. We have Dr. Bruce Holl, who is the chair of Modern Languages and Literatures Department at Trinity University. He is also editor of Russian Notes, an online compendium of news and commentary on Russia. I told him when we started Googling Russian expert San Antonio, he was about, I don't know, 117 of the first 118 entries. So very lucky to have Dr. Holl here with us tonight.
Thank you.
And my former colleague and still friend, Corey Flintoff. In his nearly 40 years as a journalist, Corey has covered pirates in Somalia, wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the earthquake in Haiti, the revolution in Egypt, and the civil war in Libya. At National Public Radio for more than 25 years, Corey most recently served as NPR's bureau chief in Moscow, covering President Vladimir Putin's crackdown on dissent, the seizure of Crimea, and war in eastern Ukraine. Since his retirement from NPR in October 2016, Corey has remained an avid consumer of information about Russia and Russian politics. So tonight, in conversation with Dr. Holl, Corey will share with you his insights and observations about a resurgent Russia and its relationship with the U.S. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, well, good evening. Good evening to you. I'm also a big admirer, as you obviously are, of Corey Flintoff. I live on the northwest side in San Antonio, and I have about a 30 to 40 minute commute one way each day. And so I heard virtually every piece that he ever
we like to trap people in there.
And by the way, they're all at NPR's website, and you can listen to them. Well, you were in Russia for probably the most interesting 4-year period in the 25, 26 years since the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So I think it'd be interesting to know what you think were the major stories that you covered in those 4 years.
I would say that, you know, there is a sort of a narrative arc to the time that I spent in Russia. It began with the big opposition protests in 2011 and 2012 in the major cities in Moscow and St. Petersburg. That was something that I think caught everyone by surprise. People in those cities, at least the sort of intelligentsia and the middle class in those cities, turned out in the tens of thousands to protest what they saw as a stolen parliamentary election, blatantly stolen, and also to protest the fact that President Putin had sort of arbitrarily announced that he was going to trade places with Dmitry Medvedev again, and resume his place as president of Russia. And that met with a great deal of resistance, which was then very systematically repressed. People who took part in the protests were arrested and given really disproportionate prison sentences. Independent media were either suppressed or co-opted, bought up by oligarchs who are sympathetic to the Kremlin. And in general, I would say that Vladimir Putin consolidated his power over the course of those 4 years. And in doing so, became increasingly anti-American in terms of propaganda, became increasingly sort of bellicose in many different ways, and that was reflected in the seizure of Crimea and in the invasion of eastern Ukraine. During my time there, we also had, for instance, the Olympic Games, the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi in 2014, which in its own way turned into a kind of a corruption scandal because it was the most expensive Olympic Games ever mounted anywhere, at the cost of about $55 billion. And it was also associated with a colossal doping scandal that even to this day hasn't been resolved. And another big story was the crash or the shoot down of Malaysian Air Flight MH17. That's one that I covered very extensively. And it was one that I think revealed the Putin regime's absolute willingness to lie and dissemble about news events that were pretty demonstrably, his versions of those news events were demonstrably false. So all that occurred and changed during my time in Russia.
And many of them are still ongoing subjects.
Yes.
The investigation of that airplane incident, those protests, not a week goes by that you don't read about somebody being arrested or retried or being sentenced in connection with that. Of course, the Olympics, and now we have similar scandals surrounding the World Cup that's supposed to take place. And I asked you if you thought it was safe for me to buy tickets for the World Cup next year, because we're thinking of going, and I think you gave me a qualified yes.
Well, yes. I mean, it's a world sporting event with an enormous amount of money involved, and I do not believe that they're going to cancel it or withdraw it from Russia under any circumstances.
All right, thank you. Well, all right, because...
So I'd go buy the tickets.
I'm going to buy the tickets. All right. Well, let me ask you about President Putin. Because people, I'm sure, ask you all the time, they do ask me all the time about Putin. And you and I corresponded recently about his potential successor. What do you think is the base of his power? I mean, how is he able to, does the military support him? I think that's a key factor. We know that, I mean, he wins the elections, which, as you say, are not free and fair. But, so what is Putin, I guess that's my first question. I mean, what is the source of his power, and will he be able to retain it?
I think he will. Well, the source of his power, I think, is the fact that the Russian government now has such complete and extensive control over public media. People in Russia get, I forget what the figure is, but I think it's on the order of 80% of the people in Russia get their news from state television. They don't have quite the internet penetration that we have here. So people actually have numerous channels, but they're all in some way either directly controlled by the state or controlled by people who are friendly to the Kremlin. Independent news media, as I said, have been suppressed. And if you watch Russian television for any length of time, you'll see that every single day there's a segment that shows President Putin in very favorable light, leading his country, making important decisions, correcting the course of lesser officials, He is, in a way, that Russia has always had what they call the image of the good czar. that Russia during the Tsarist times, Russian people were sort of taught to feel that the Tsar himself was a good and benevolent person, and that he only knew how the people out in the provinces were suffering under the yoke of cruel landowners and local officials, he would solve their problems for them. And a bit of that has rubbed off on Mr. Putin. He is regarded as the kind of a figure who embodies Russia and the strength of Russia, the power of the Russian government, as a benevolent leader, a guy who has restored the relevance of Russia as a world power. And so that's why he has approximately an 82% approval rating right now.
It's interesting you mentioned the comparison. In Tsarist Russia, petitions from the people were the way to try to solve your problem. You would send a petition, and they had thousands and thousands of these petitions, and they actually had a very large bureaucracy, and people would read the petitions, and then maybe some problems would get solved. And what Putin does, and I know you listen to the whole thing, is has people call in, and the questions are prearranged and the show is rehearsed. But once a year, he sits for 4 hours and answers questions. Now, I heard today that people near Moscow had called, and they'd said, we have this open garbage dump and we can't live near it, the smell, and people dump their illegal in. And today it got cleaned up. So he will do that sort of thing. Now you listened to the call-in show. Did you glean any interesting information from this year's?
No, in fact, in a way, Putin seemed a little bit disengaged this year. Yeah. He is. I've seen him, and I've seen him in fora that are a bit like this theater, because he works very hard. He travels all the time and visits cities throughout Russia, and he is engaged in fora like this and theaters like this. And he's a very charismatic figure. I think he's grown into his role as the leader of Russia. So we know that he's not a terribly tall man, but he physically manages to fill a lot of space. He's a man spreader, for one thing. And if you see him on television, he's often sitting like this. And he does manage he has a lot of presence. He is a good speaker. He speaks well off the cuff. He responds well to people's questions. And he's a decisive guy. So that gives him a lot of sort of weight, authority as a figure.
Yeah. Well, the other side of it, as you say, starting in 2011, 2012, there were protests, and periodically they've occurred since then. And the interesting thing, too, about the more recent protests, earlier there would be some pretext for the protest, traffic in Moscow or pollution in Lake Baikal. So technically it wouldn't be a protest against the leadership but now they actually protest and they come out and they say, down with Putin, or let's have free and fair elections. And there is an opposition movement, and maybe people have heard of Alexei Navalny. He's the leader. Do you think, is it possible? You never know in Russia. I mean, is Navalny, is he going to survive this? Is he potentially somebody who could one day challenge Putin? Could there be a coup? Is there a real opposition that poses a threat?
I would have, if you'd asked me this question 8 months ago, say, I would have said no. I would have said the opposition in Russia has been so thoroughly squelched that I don't see any likelihood whatsoever that Mr. Putin could be in any danger, especially from Alexei Navalny. But I was really quite surprised. Actually, I should say I'm in touch with all my friends in Moscow, and there was a protest that was called by Navalny, but it was a memorial. It was a 2-year memorial for the murder of Boris Nemtsov, the opposition leader who was gunned down right in front of the Kremlin. And I wrote to a friend of mine who always takes part in these demonstrations and asked her how it was, and because I'd seen video of what looked like a lot of people. And she wrote back and she said, no, it was really disappointing. There were 5,000 fewer people this year, and God, all of us are so old. You know, and I look around me at these protests and I see all the same people, you know, carrying the same signs, and no young people. And just, I think, 2 months later, there was this big anti-corruption rally in more than 100 Russian cities. And it was composed largely of young people. And the reason they came out was because Alexei Navalny, as an opposition leader, doesn't have real access to the Russian news media. And so the way he makes up for it is on YouTube. And he does these rather wonderful, rather witty YouTube exposés of Russian officials. And he did one about Dmitry Medvedev and his unaccounted for wealth. And it's available on YouTube. You can watch it. It's called Don't Call Him Dima, or
Right.
Demon.
Which was a demon, which was his, it sounds like demon, but it's not. It was, apparently that was his name is Dmitry, so Dima, so that was his childhood
Right.
demon.
So in other words, don't be too familiar about this guy.
Right.
But the reason, the thing that actually got people's attention for this video, and as I say, it is captioned in English, you can watch it, was the way he presented, the way he uncovered Medvedev's corruption. Turns out that Dmitry Medvedev is a kind of a gearhead, and he likes to order things on the web. And he likes fancy sports gear. He likes really nice training suits and sneakers. And in fact, you see him pictured often wearing these really expensive, beautiful sneakers. And so it turns out that it was traceable. They discovered that the very ensemble that Dmitry was shown wearing at one of his dachas was one that had been ordered on the web shortly beforehand and delivered to an address belonging to a good childhood friend of his. So you were able to see the order form, and then Dmitry himself dressed in this gear. And he did this repeatedly. He showed over and over again that he's ordering this kind of gear. Well, the delivery to the friend was a chance to trace the beginning of Medvedev's web of companies and offshore entities and devices, shells that he uses to cover up his wealth. Right. And it turns out that he has mansions and estates and yachts and villas in Italy and things like that. Colossal wealth, on a Russian, even a Russian prime minister doesn't make that kind of money. So this is absolutely unaccounted for money, and the demonstration was so clear and so understandable that it aroused the wrath of a lot of Russians who are suffering through a really difficult time economically. And that's what helped to trigger these big opposition protests.
One of the mansions was discovered to have a duck farm, or a duck, whatever you call it, if you raise ducks.
Yeah, a duck house, a lake.
A duck house on it. And so after the film came out, thereafter at every protest, you'll see he's associated with the duck now, and you'll see human-sized inflatable ducks, and the press will...
The little yellow kind, the bathtub ducks.
Right, like your kids had, but they'll get the big of this, so there'll be ducks protesting, and it's so they're making fun of them, which is different too. I mean, than protests in the past. This is not just a grim. They make fun at him, make fun of him. Well, the difference I notice when I look at, for example, these protests you covered, and say the protests in August of 1991 that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the military and security presence in '91 was a bunch of draftees who, weren't doing that well either, and didn't intervene. And when people protested, now there are security, military, massive presence, and they always wear these sort of Star Wars.
It's that black bubble helmet, and they are very well-trained riot police.
So did you, I mean, and here you are an American journalist, did you come into contact with the security forces? Did you find them a big presence in everywhere you went? Yeah.
Yes. So, you know, I mean, yeah, there are, throughout the whole time that we were there were sanctioned protests, and people would go to them, but, you know, to get into the protests, you have to go to Pushkin Square, where there's a row of these metal detectors that you have to line up and go through, and you see, you know, this whole area is lined with these black helmeted riot police.
Yeah.
So that's your introduction, and then along the whole parade route, typically every cross street will have a couple of platoons of these people, you know. So, you know, there is an element of intimidation that no matter how sanctioned the protest may be, you're always reminded that you could be arrested. And one of the other techniques that they use is to arrest people more or less at random. You know, if there is something that seems, even in a sanctioned protest, if there's something that they don't like, they'll step in and they'll start arresting people, you know, in the middle of the crowd. So 4 police will go right through the center of the crowd, pick someone out who might be an old guy with a cardboard sign, might be a young man who's been yelling, you know, seize them, drag them away, put them in the paddy wagon. You know, so, and the idea is the randomness is part of the lesson. You have to be reminded that it's not just the leaders that we're after. Anybody could be swept up in this.
I send students to Russia every year, and they occasionally come into contact. One of my students rather imprudently managed to buy a police uniform, an authentic one, on the black market. And he I won't name him, but he wore it to a Halloween party, and he's coming back. This is not in Moscow where Corey worked, but in St. Petersburg, and coming home from the Halloween party. He didn't get arrested, but people, you know, inebriated people or people that needed help came up to him on the street and tried to ask him to help. And he's only a second-year Russian student, so it was beyond him. But I said, well, you know, probably if you had asked me, should I buy a police uniform on the black market, I might have said no. I don't know.
You know, that actually brings something up. You know, Russia has its own terrorism problem.
Yes.
And, you know, the fact that you can you know, remember that when President Putin was confronted about the fact that Russian troops were active in eastern Ukraine, and they were wearing Russian uniforms, he said, well, you can buy them in any store. Turns out it's true.
Yes, it's true. And they were all volunteers,
Yes.
and both Navalny and Nemtsov, whom you mentioned, published a lot of details. Nemtsov, just at the time he was murdered, published an entire small book on that subject, which is the Russians in Ukraine. Well, let me ask you something else, a little different tack. The Russians, and you mentioned the state media, and you can watch on DirecTV, and it's more balanced than in Soviet times, which isn't saying much. So you'll get the occasional opposition figure who gets shouted down, but they have talking points that they stick to, and one of them is that the Americans are Russophobic. You know, Americans don't like us. All these things are unfair that they say about us. And sometimes, I looked up the quote today. It was Senator McCain who said, "Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country." You know. And I think some Americans, and Charles Krauthammer from Fox makes some similar statements. So Americans get this, you know, this kind of one-sided impression of Russians. So I wanted you to talk about, you know, to the extent that you can, about a country of 150 million people. You know, how are these misperceptions wrong, and what was your life like among the Russian people?
You know, it's great. I have to say, you know, we took this job without really having a good sense of what we were going to encounter in Russia. And everybody, you know, certainly everybody my age has this notion of sort of Soviet times, you know, the great capital of Russia, you know, and these sort of Soviet apartment blocks and that kind of thing. Moscow and St. Petersburg and many of the big provincial cities that we visited are really vibrant places, you know. during the good times, as far as oil prices were concerned, the government did in fact spend a lot of money on beautification of the cities. In Moscow, for instance, they revived all the great Soviet public parks. And you know, everybody's heard of Gorky Park. It has been completely refurbished, and it's absolutely beautiful, sort of Central Park-like area. My wife Diana and I used to go there quite often just for the pleasure of seeing ordinary Russians out there enjoying themselves in this beautiful, beautifully appointed, and it still has a lot of Soviet monuments in it, but this wonderful, wonderful park. Moscow has great cultural opportunities, fabulous museums, of course, terrific ballet companies, opera companies. For people who speak Russian, it has more theaters than New York City, I'm sure. So it's a wonderful place to be. And Russian people don't have, as far as, I think we met one person who sort of berated us about being Americans. The whole time we were there, the rest of the time people were interested in Americans, welcoming, curious, and we had, frankly, a great time. It's not the Russian people or the Russian society that I have differences with, it's the Russian leadership.
And do the Russian people still feel that way? I mean, that was the way we kind of looked at it, or that they did in Soviet times. Do they still feel that way about us? I mean, there are two, as you know, two major polling agencies, just two, but one of them always reflects the government point of view. The other one, the Levada Center, is more, it seems to me more accurate because there's a little more variety, but one or both of these polls show that, well, there's less desire now in Russia to emigrate to the United States. There's less attraction to the United States because of everything that's happened in the last 4 or 5 years. Did you find that?
Yes, I think that is true. You know, then another thing that struck me, about this pervasive propaganda is that when we left, which is in September of last year, you could almost believe that if you watched Russian media, that the United States and Russia were on the very brink of war.
Nice.
Something that people in America had no real concept of all, and yet Russians were being told daily, particularly around Hillary Clinton. If I saw newspaper headlines that said, if Hillary is elected, she will surround us with nuclear warheads. Wow. Television commentators daily would talk about how dangerous the United States government had become, the United States leadership had become, the United States establishment. They don't, they don't say bad things about Americans as a population, but certainly they regard the American government as a threat, and the American political establishment especially.
Yeah. The format is different. I watch Russian talk shows, kind of addicted, and the typical format, there will be 6 or 7 people representing the Russian government point of view, and the topic might be Ukraine. So there'll be one Ukrainian who's going to represent the Ukrainian point of view, or if the topic is America, there'll be one American who speaks Russian who represents the American point of view, and they will just shout him down, and to the point you quite often can't get a word in edgewise. And I'm interested in your relations with the media. I mean, who were your sources? Who did you didn't really have contacts with these state-run, with the federal channels, or I know I saw that you had some sources that were connected with RAIN, TV RAIN, which is an opposition source. Is that who you, did you know a lot of people from that aspect of the Russian media?
Yeah, actually, we found that increasingly over the course of 4 years, Russian officials became less and less willing to talk to us, until by the end, probably by the last year that I was there, I put in the same requests to interview Russian officials at various ministries and so forth, and typically would get a stall You know, well, we have to see what the minister or the spokesperson is doing, and the idea is to delay you and delay you and delay you until your deadline has passed. You know, and then they tell you, well, no, we aren't. We aren't going to comment on that. So a lot of my sources were think tank people, academics, you know, people from NGOs. I mean, there are still quite active NGOs there. Memorial is one that's been severely repressed by the government, but it is a strong sort of civil rights voice in Russia. Amnesty International has a strong branch there. So there are people who are speaking out on behalf of repressed people and so forth. But the space for that kind of opposition is getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And the best example of that probably is the foreign agent law. There was a law passed that said essentially any Russian organization that got foreign funding from anywhere, if it had political activities that could be defined as political activities, it would be obliged to register as a foreign agent. And from Soviet times on, the label foreign agent has meant spy, you know, foreign influence person. And so nobody in the NGO community wanted to be identified as a spy, and most of them actually resisted it. But little by little, the space is becoming narrower and narrower, and many of these organizations, like Golos, for instance, the
voter registration.
Yeah, voter registration organization that did a lot of really important work as far as registering voters and monitoring the polls. The fact that people knew in 2011 that their election had been stolen was made clear by these organizations like Golos. So that, you know, those are the people that we interviewed. Finally, at the very end, finally a Russian official said to me, you know, there's no point in my talking to you. You know, it's a lose-lose for me if I'm quoted by a foreign reporter. Why should I? I mean, either I will say something wrong, you'll take it out of context, you'll make me look bad to my bosses. Why should I do this? And moreover, because you broadcast outside of Russia, I don't care what you have to say.
Well, that was direct. I find they're a lot more sophisticated. I mean, I suspect they know the difference between NPR and Fox News and CNN, and which was the first one there, you know, in late Soviet times. So people know what NPR was and what that represented.
By and large, yes. You know, government officials would, and NGO people would.
Right.
But ordinary people, no idea. And you know, sometimes we'd have to say, well, you know, like BBC, only in America.
Right. Well, yes. But it's got a little bit, I mean, they might look, maybe you're, you know, the audience isn't quite as large as the CBS Evening News, but it's the people that listen to it and where they listen to it. I'm sure they were aware of that. You mentioned one organization, it's called Memorial, and they got their start researching the history of the various crimes of the Lenin and Stalin eras. And I'm just curious, and we talked a little about this, do people know about that aspect of their history? They all know about the Great Patriotic War, which is that part of World War II that took place on Soviet territory. And it's a big thing in public discourse and popular culture. But do they know or talk about you know, the genocides, the internal emigrations, the famines that were caused by government policy?
You know, the stunning thing is that I met so many people who had family members who were disappeared or sent to the Gulag or shot. Especially during the Great Terror, you know, of the late 1930s. Not uncommon to talk to people who would say, yeah, both my grandfathers were military officers, both of them shot. My family changed our name because we didn't want to be associated with this person who'd been identified as a traitor. I met people whose families had been transported, people from the Baltics whose families were transported to Central Asia, people who underwent incredible hardships. And yet there is almost no public discussion about this. So people know about this privately. They know about it in their own lives, but they don't, it's not taught in the schools. President Putin, in that question and answer session last week, talked about Stalin, and he one of the things he said, is that there's extreme criticism. We shouldn't have this extreme criticism of Stalin. I thought to myself, well, what about if you just recite his crimes? Is that would that be construed as moderate criticism? This is a man, who was instrumental in the deaths of millions of people, and it seems to me that Mr. Putin feels that it's more important. Well, he was a Soviet man. He was raised, under the Soviet system, educated under the Soviet system, a member of the KGB throughout his early career. I think for him, it's more important to preserve the legitimacy of a single autocratic leader than to acknowledge the crimes that leader committed. So that's why they don't, they're willing to criticize Lenin because they're willing to criticize communism, but they're not willing to criticize Stalin.
And in fact, in the call-in show, Putin quite accurately recounted one of Lenin's crimes, which is to order the execution of about 17,000 Russian Orthodox priests. And he'll talk about Lenin. I mean, Lenin, nobody who was personally victimized by Lenin is alive. And the other thing is the Great Patriotic War. That's the great victory, and it just grows every year. And that's what they want the young people to learn. And so Stalin was the leader during the Great Patriotic War. So you can't have one without the other. And I think that probably figures too.
Exactly. And I have to say that the Russian government has revived the military glory of the Great Patriotic War. And from the Russian point of view, it was Russia that won the Second World War. Absolutely Russia that destroyed the Germans. Russia that fought the fascists at tremendous sacrifice. And in fact, the sacrifice part is absolutely true. So I'm told that over the past 15 or 20 years, the military demonstrations, on Victory Day, for instance, had been downplayed, and there was less fanfare given to it. People were kind of forgetting about it. Putin has revived the military parades, the glorification of Russia's victories, and in fact, Victory Day is just an amazing holiday. But it is a very militaristic holiday, and it's one that's designed to remind the people that you may have to make sacrifices for the homeland, just as your grandparents did.
Yeah. But you told me too, and we talked about Victory Day before. I think the first, I talked to you around Victory Day, but people are very emotional about it too. The other aspect of the parade is people in cities throughout the world, really even in New York City and in Toronto, large public gatherings in which people carry portraits of the loved one, the grandfather, the father in Putin's case, who served during the Great Patriotic War. So people are genuinely emotional about that, and in a way it's kind of, so you can talk about what happened to your family there, and as you say, you can't talk about what happened in the camps and so forth, but you can still show your emotion over what happened to your family. But you found people very sincere.
Yeah, I think it was an outlet for people, who were genuinely sincere about having that opportunity. And in fact, there are still some veterans. I mean, they're obviously like our World War II veterans. They're very, very old people these days, but you do see people out there, and this is a Soviet picture that we used to see a lot, where old men and women with chests absolutely covered with medals.
Yeah.
And these people are revered in Russia.
And on Victory Day, they're on television. I watched an interview with 4 veterans, and it had to have been in their late 80s or early 90s, I guess. But as policy in the Soviet Union and now in Russia that every veteran of the Great Patriotic War who needs housing will receive that housing. Housing will be made available for free, and you still read about that. There's not many of them left, so it's easier to fulfill now.
There were some scandals involved in that too, and this speaks of the corruption of the Russian government. And this actually came up during one of Putin's question and answer periods, I think in 2011. Somebody raised the question of, well, we have in our village, we have a blind a vet who was blinded in the service. He lives in a house without running water, without proper heat, and without an indoor toilet. And this blind man has to go out in all kinds of weather, find his way using a rope, between the outhouse and the house, and take care of himself that way. And it raised a lot of outrage in Russia that local officials had not taken care of this man. And in fact, one of my reporting colleagues, a Russian guy, is a very patriotic man and has the same love and reverence for Russian veterans, was absolutely outraged by this. Well, the very next year, somebody went out and did a follow-up story on this poor man who is still making his way to the outhouse by way of this frozen rope stretched between the house. And, so in fact, they play a lot of lip service to these veterans, but they don't get the care that they deserve.
They don't. I mean, I think they just basically, it sounds blunt, but sort of running out the clock on the issue, and they will try. I'm surprised in a way that they didn't find housing for that man, because everybody saw it on national TV. Well, we haven't talked yet a lot about American-Russian relations. I mean, and maybe people will want to ask you about that too. But the one thing that I know you've written about, and it's a little more hard news type of thing, but people aren't aware of the scope of the war in Ukraine. You did touch on it earlier, but the UN now estimates that I think it's close to 11,000 people now that have been killed. This is a very large-scale war. And so what were and you covered it, I know. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it.
We covered it quite a lot. And when I was covering it, you had the advantage that you could cross the lines fairly easily between the Ukrainian side and the so-called separatist side. So I spent a lot of time in Donetsk and in Lugansk, which are the two cities in eastern Ukraine that are the two, actually, the capitals of provinces in eastern Ukraine that were always heavily Russified and didn't identify themselves as being particularly Ukrainian. But I was there at the very beginning of this so-called uprising, and you could see, that what happened was that cadres of men would take over government buildings in these towns and fortify them. And they were not your sort of peasants with pitchforks or, local people who were outraged at the Ukrainian government. They were, in fact, many of them Russian agents leading these sort of corps of kind of jailbirds and thugs and you see people with their prison tattoos, manning these barricades, and most of them were just sort of violent opportunists. But little by little, they built a sort of a militia movement that actually was manned by local Ukrainian Russians, and they were strongly supported by the Russian military. In fact, it's estimated that the combined separatist provinces have, or the People's Republics, as they call themselves, have 700 tanks. Biggest tank army in Europe. Belongs to an obscure little separatist movement that covers about 10% of eastern Ukraine. Vladimir Putin will tell you, of course, and does repeatedly, that Russia has nothing to do with this.
Right.
You know,
Right.
so presumably they bought those tanks at the same store where they got their uniform.
Right. Well, but what you see on Russian TV, I don't know if you saw this piece, but you'll remember this, the separatists in this piece, they've got to fight the Ukrainian regular forces, and they go to a military museum, and then they find an old World War II era machine gun, and they're able to restore it, and they use that to defend their position. But you say there's 700 tanks there
Exactly.
in case the World War II machine gun doesn't work out.
Yeah, we saw, when we were still able to travel pretty freely in the separatist territories, we saw a lot of sophisticated Russian equipment. And actually, right after MH17 was shot down, that was when people started looking for the anti-aircraft system that shot it down. It was a pretty sophisticated system. It's called a Buk. And it's a mobile rocket launcher that fires these very powerful, rather sophisticated missiles, and that all the experts agree that's what took down this Malaysian passenger jet.
Right.
Well, I was, you know, when you travel around war zones, you typically travel around with a group of 2 or 3 other correspondents, and I was with a correspondent from The Independent. And his editor did a search of photographs that had been posted on the web that had to do with military equipment in eastern Ukraine, and the things that people took with their cell phones and then would put on the web. And sure enough, they came up with a photograph of a Buk. And it was shot in an area that was pretty identifiable. You know, you may remember this, there was a street corner, there was a gas station, there was, and it was geolocated according to the town where this thing passed through. So we actually went to this little town, and we went to this gas station, and we posted ourselves around the area until we found the place where that photograph had been taken. And then we went around and we interviewed everybody that we could find, shopkeepers and the gas station attendants and restaurant people, and there was a kind of a gambling hall there and the dress shop. Talked to all these people, and frankly, we didn't find anybody who remembered seeing this.
I'm sure you didn't.
But New York Times, you know, that's because we were there for 2 or 3 hours, and we just happened to interview the people we interviewed. New York Times came along a couple of days later, and sure enough, they found somebody who'd seen this thing. So what happened after that was that a citizen journalist group called Bellingcat took on this as a cause to find out where this particular sophisticated weapon came from. And they managed to find a series of photographs and web posts by Russian soldiers that eventually established that this particular anti-aircraft weapon was brought across the Russian border at a certain time, came into eastern Ukraine. They found the location where actually the rockets had been fired, or a rocket had been fired, and they established, I think quite definitively, certainly to my satisfaction, that this plane was actually shot down by a Russian military crew using Russian weapons. And that's the kind of thing I think that established for me pretty definitively just how active the Russian military is in eastern Ukraine.
Now, in that episode, and first they said, well, it may have been shot down by a Ukrainian, you know, an air-to-air. But as you say, it's pretty much established that.
Well, the Russian Defense Ministry issued a photograph that showed MH17. It was a satellite photograph, and so you could see the passenger jet down below, and you could see in the corner there was a very small image of a Ukrainian fighter jet. And so the same group, Bellingcat, looked at this image, and they went back through the satellite images that had been made of this very same area for a week or 10 days before the shoot down and a week or 10 days afterwards. And sure enough, they found this photograph And the way they identified it was by the cloud formations. They were able to match the cloud formations in this photograph. And it was, in fact, it was never really established that that was the Malaysian passenger jet. You couldn't really tell from the photograph. But it was possible to tell that that little image of the Ukrainian fighter jet was photoshopped.
And so they eventually basically admitted what you said, but then they said, and maybe there's more validity in this argument, that our positions were being bombed. You know, a passenger airliner shouldn't have been flying over a region that is, there was plenty of publicity about this conflict. They should have known better than to fly there, and so they weren't necessarily, they then claimed, trying to shoot down passenger jets and Malaysian Airlines. They thought they might, and even The Economist, which is a magazine that's pretty anti-Russian, admitted that, well, they were being bombed at that time, so that's probably why they shot the plane down.
In fact, they had successfully shot down a couple of Ukrainian fighter jets, fighter bombers. But I mean, the fact that the reason that Russia will not admit, or that the Kremlin will not admit that that was a Russian crew that did it, is because then they would have to admit that this whole thing was this whole separatist war was a creation of the Kremlin, basically. And once you admit one element of it is true, then you're open to the possibility that all the other elements could be true too.
You said one thing, the way you described originally the militias and their leaders and the criminal. Well, and I don't know if this began happening before you left, but in recent times, some of these sort of independent actors that began the militia movement in Lugansk and Donetsk they've been killed systematically. And I don't know, you covered it. The speculation is that Moscow does not really want independent actors kind of trying to carve out their own territories, so they're getting rid of these people and replacing them with their own more reliable people.
Yeah, I don't know what the death toll is right now, but it is exactly like a mafia gang war. People's cars have been blown up, their apartments are blown up, they're shot by snipers, it's just... and they included many people that I interviewed in the course of time, and I won't say that it couldn't happen to a nicer person, but
some of them were. Yes. Do you see? What resolution do you see? There have been several peace accords, agreements, and there's another one right now. How do you see it being resolved?
I see it as turning into a frozen conflict.
Yeah.
For instance, in other areas where this kind of thing has happened, where there's been a Russian-backed separatist movement, for instance in Abkhazia, which is a part of Georgia, that's connected to Russian territory on the Black Sea. It's very much the same thing happened. Russia sent in peacekeepers and essentially occupied this area, installed their own local administration, and that became a frozen conflict. It's never been resolved. Georgia has never gotten its territories back. The same thing happened in Moldova. Right on the border between Ukraine and Moldova, there's a separatist area that's also enforced by Russian peacekeepers, and once again, that place, it's Transnistria, is regarded as the best example of a Soviet open-air museum that could be seen anywhere in Eastern Europe. It is run as practically a Soviet socialist republic. So these places are controlled by local gangsters, and they're usually very corrupt administrations, and I think, frankly, that's what's going to happen in eastern Ukraine as well. Russia is not going to let those territories go back to Ukraine, and in fact, that territory gives Russia quite a bit of leverage against the Ukrainian government, because when the Ukrainian government starts to show more success in becoming a more pro-Western country, then they raise the temperature in eastern Ukraine. They create a lot of they increase the amount of fighting that takes place, and create a distraction for the Ukrainian government to deal with.
I should not be given the task of timekeeper, because I'm wholly unreliable because I get so involved in the conversation, I forget. But we are going to ask if we could bring the conversation to the whole room now. If you have a question, we have a couple folks with microphones. Please raise your hand and wait until you have a mic, because we are taping the events tonight, taping the discussion.
I'd like to ask, what is the role of the justice system in Russia in addressing corrupt elections, other corrupt practices? Is there any power in the judiciary? Is it ostensibly independent?
No.
Next question.
It's a pretty good illustration of what happens when the separation of government powers no longer works. One of the things that I think the Putin regime has successfully done is co-opted the judiciary in Russia. And an example of how that works is in the case of, we mentioned Alexei Navalny. He was sort of the best known and kind of most attractive opposition candidate, although in fact he had fairly low name recognition in Russia, and as we said, very little access to media. But I mean, he was popular enough to create a fuss and to become a problem for the Kremlin. So what they did was charge him and his brother on pretty patently trumped up charges. And they were both found guilty. The brother was sent to prison. And I think it was clear to virtually everybody that this was a completely unfair, politicized judicial process. But that's not the point. The point is that it doesn't matter whether you committed a crime or not. We're going to blacken your name so that, and make sure that people think you, even if you weren't guilty of this particular crime, you must be guilty of something. And the other thing is to show that you can arbitrarily be tried and convicted. And in fact, Navalny's brother is still in prison. Yeah. So, no. There is no independent judiciary.
And the other thing, Navalny, if you're a convicted felon, you cannot run for president.
Right.
And he's a convicted felon, and they just reissued this ruling yesterday, the day before. No, he may not run for president.
Okay. I think we had a question at the back of the room. Who has the mic back there?
Thank you so much again for being here. I'm very excited to be reading your work soon. My main question for you is, so Hannah Arendt, I don't know if you know her, she focuses on the book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. And one of the ideas that really kind of breeds in Russia or with Putin's regime is this idea of disinformation, and that when you continually tell lies, the worry is not that the lies will become truth, but rather the lies will deconstruct all understanding of reality and thus dismantle a system. And so how has that been used against you as a journalist, and how has that affected your career? And how have you seen it in both the Russian experience, but also in the American experience? Because that seems to be something just as terrifyingly present.
Mm-hmm. Well, sort of, as far as it affected me and my job, I think the sort of biggest danger that was created by this sort of atmosphere of disinformation is that there is false equivalency between one narrative about the truth and another one. And this is something that Western journalists fall into because, we're supposed to be fair and balanced, as Fox News is. We are supposed to find the other sides of the story, not just the sort of in a binary way, but as many different aspects to a story as we can. And there is a danger that there's a tendency that Western journalists particularly fall into, is the notion that because there are two or three sides, they must be equivalent in some way, or at least in all fairness, we must present them as being somehow equivalent, even if one is demonstrably false and another is demonstrably true. We feel that we have to let the false side speak out as fully as the true side. So, you know, that's how it's affected me. And in Russia particularly, you know, if someone in the government, and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was our sort of overwatch, you know, they're the ones who kept track of what Western journalists do in Russia. If there was something that they didn't like, they'd say, well, you know, you didn't fairly present the position of the Russian government. And I'd say, well, you know, I asked for comment from all these people, they wouldn't talk to me. You know? So that's the way it works there. The way it works here, I think, is very much the same. You know, people are presented with alternative facts, and, you know, in fact, there is no such thing. An alternative fact is a lie. So, you know, and in fact, there is, the result is that people start to doubt everything. Or, you know, the Russians are very good about whataboutism. You know, you say, well, you did such and such, and tell me about why you did this. And they say, well, what about the time that America had slavery? Right. You know, these things are treated as equivalent and something that you need to chase down every element of, and it just, it's bad for the news atmosphere in general.
That one dates to Soviet times, and I've heard that throughout my career. What about slavery? Well, I'm obviously not going to defend it, but you know, the immensity of the Stalin experience, or maybe even not slavery, but something smaller that happened in the United States. And as you say, no, there's just no, you can't, there's not a one-to-one correspondence between the Stalin experience and the Haymarket riots or whatever it might be.
I have a question. I'd like your thoughts on the Russian influence on the U.S. election. And another part of that is you said the Russian people were told to be afraid of Hillary. What are they told about Trump?
By and large, the coverage of Trump while I was there, which of course was just in the time leading up to the election, was very positive. They did see him as somebody who would be a sort of disruptor of the American political establishment. And as I said, you know, the regime particularly believes that the American political establishment is just irrevocably against Russia. And, you know, so they had high hopes for Mr. Trump. I talked to a Russian political analyst who said, well, you know, we know that we think of him as being unpredictable. It's possible that, you know, if he got elected somehow he could turn against us. We don't know that, but in any case we think that he's a safer quantity for us because he'll either make a deal with us or he'll keep things in such turmoil in the United States that we won't have as much opposition on the world stage as we would have if, say, Hillary had been elected. So that was kind of the attitude going into this. I was not surprised, by the way, by today's announcement that that Mr. Putin has been directly traced as having ordered the hacking. And I don't think anybody else, I don't think Russians would be. Major decisions, all major decisions in the Russian regime are made by Mr. Putin. So you would, I think any Russian would have assumed that, yes, indeed, he did do that. And I'm surprised that the Trump administration is saying, well, we have to look into this because we just read this report ourselves. Well, no, the intelligence, the first intelligence briefings that Mr. Trump got when he, after he was elected, would have been about this very subject. So I think the time has come for everybody to say, yes, we knew about this. Whether you believed it was one thing, but you have to admit that you knew about it.
What I thought was interesting today in that Washington Post story that you mentioned was, I think for the first time, but maybe you correct me, they actually said that they have some human intelligence inside the Kremlin, and we're not going to say, the CIA has asked us not to say much more than that, but I think that was the first time I read or heard that they claim they have a source inside the Kremlin who heard it firsthand from Putin. That's kind of...
Yeah, obviously, an autocratic government is in a much better position to control both its message and its secrets, because of course, there's leakage in the Russian government as well, but it's nothing like the leakage in the American. I should say that.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Were you finished? In the back row?
Yes, I can't resist, please. What is your opinion concerning President Trump's affinity for Mr. Putin?
I'm sorry?
What is your opinion concerning our president's affinity towards Putin in Russia? And what's the source of it, in your opinion?
Well, I think for one thing that, let's put the best possible color on this. And let's say that Mr. Trump and his companies were always treated very well in Russia. And of course his son Eric has said that, in roughly in 2006 or thereabouts, they were getting a tremendous amount of investment money from Russia. And of course, the Miss Universe contest. Obviously, Mr. Trump was excited to be there. He felt that he got a good reception. He felt that he got a friendly reception from the Russians, and that the Russians were people who were willing to negotiate and do business. So let's put the best possible spin on this and say that the Trump team believed that a way to score an early geopolitical victory would be to make a deal with Russia, possibly to remove some of the sanctions that were imposed as a result of the Ukrainian war, and achieve some kind of agreement to stop the war in Syria. That would be a real diplomatic coup. To put a less favorable spin on it, let's say that among the enormous amount of Russian money that flowed into the Trump enterprises in the early 2000s, it would be very difficult. I did a story about this, about the billions of dollars of corruptly obtained money that was flowing out of Russia. Even during the years that I were there, it was nothing to hear of $100 billion going overseas. And that money was being invested especially in real estate, in places like New York City and London. London just went through an enormous scandal, a money laundering scandal, about Russian money that was invested in London real estate. And I think it is not impossible to believe that the very same thing happened in New York real estate. And when you're doing business with these people, the reason that enormous amount of money is coming out is because it's by and large stolen. And unless you are extremely diligent, it's very difficult not to find yourself involved in a money laundering scheme. And if that were true, then it might be that the Russians would be able to reveal a great deal of this money laundering, and it would be an enormous embarrassment, if not a criminal issue, with the Trump organization.
Okay, I think we have time for maybe one or possibly two more, depending on how long the answers run. Least favorite part of my job is cutting this off. I'm so sorry.
Just a quick question. Thank you for the conversation, but I'm wondering if you could comment on the level of risk that the Baltics, that Russia posed on the Baltics.
I did a lot of stories in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia, where they are very, very concerned about what they see as Russian aggression. It has been estimated that even though those countries are members of NATO, a Russian offensive against them could capture all their territory in a matter of the time varies, but between 48 and 60 hours, Russian troops and tanks could overrun all three countries without any serious difficulty. I did a story with Lithuanian soldiers, actually, who were out training, and what they're training in is essentially guerrilla warfare, because they anticipate that if they were attacked by Russia, all they could do would be to slow the advance and complicate it as much as possible, and then they would be on their own. I mean, they would hope to slow things until hopefully their NATO allies would come to their aid. This is, it's a very uncomfortable situation for them, because NATO, as we know, hasn't shown the degree of commitment that might be required if in fact those tiny countries were invaded, and certainly Mr. Trump hasn't. So yeah, it's a risk. On the other hand, I don't think that there's any payoff for Russia really in doing that, unless that they felt that they were existentially threatened, say by missiles or something like that.
You mentioned the Transnistria. I think that a region like that is much more likely to be the next flashpoint. It's hard to imagine them invading the Baltics. But some of these regions that are historically in the Russian sphere are much longer than the Baltics, and so that I think you're correct. That's probably more likely the next flashpoint.
Okay, last question here.
Thank you very much. You mentioned about the power that Putin has been building, and there is a fact that in his early stages of taking the government, he organized leaders from past KGB to participate in government agencies or joint ventures that later on have been reintegrated in the government. Have you seen lately that trend as a significant source of power?
I'm sorry, the question is, have I seen KGB influence in?
Putin influence due to that initial strategy.
That Putin, as an early strategy, put KGB officers into leadership positions and now is sort of reaping the benefit of that.
I think that's true. It's true at the very top of the Russian Orthodox Church, for instance. The Russian Patriarch Kirill is a Soviet-era KGB member, and his predecessor as Patriarch was also a KGB agent. And that's because, during Soviet times, the Soviets co-opted, Stalin particularly co-opted the Russian Orthodox Church and made it into more of an instrument of state policy. So that's an example where, in fact, the KGB influence still exists. And of course, many of the Siloviki, the
security
members of the Kremlin circle who are particularly from the intelligence services and the military are KGB officials, who then went on to become oligarchs in their own right, to take over state industries and that kind of thing. So yes, so in fact, the KGB as an organization it's like the Marine Corps or a fraternity, you never leave.
Well, with that, Dr. Holl, Corey, thank you very, very much. It was fascinating. Just a quick thanks again to Rich Asti and the McNay for hosting us here, to our sponsors, the World Affairs Council of San Antonio, Jefferson Cano, a San Antonio law firm, St. Mary's University Graduate Studies. Thank you to all of you for attending and for your support of Texas Public Radio. Good night and be safe on the way home.
Thank you. That was pretty wonderful.